of Israel was the birthplace of the Jewish people, and Jewish history begins in Hebron. Hebron today is a city of contradictions. Lying 20 miles south of Jerusalem, 3,000 feet high in the Judean hills, its streets, monuments, hills, and alleyways span 4,000 years of diverse and often conflicting cultures. From the Jewish history of Abraham and the patriarchs to the first kingdom of David, the revolts against Greece and Rome, the Maccabees, Herod the Great, the Crusaders, Arabs, Turks, British, and finally again the Jews. Its grandest structure is also its most famous, the cave of Machpelah, the tombs of the patriarchs. For all its busy activity, its Arab population of merchants and tradesmen, and its growing Jewish community, it retains a certain timeless quality, belying its turbulent past. Its plazas, streets, and narrow, dusty lanes echoing with the sounds of the past, the wail of the muezzin calling the Islamic faithful to prayer, the sense of thousands of years embedded in its stones, the haggling of the marketplace, the bray of a donkey, the sounds of Hebrew prayer. This is the crux of Hebron, whose past reaches into its present. The story of Hebron is an enduring love story, one of the most extraordinary in man's history. It begins nearly 4,000 years ago in ancient Sumer, Mesopotamia, with a nomad named Abraham. The Bible recounts how Abraham hears a divine voice commanding him to leave his home and cross into a new land, the land of Canaan, saying, "I will give unto thee and thy seed after thee all the land of Canaan for an everlasting possession." Abraham's path takes him on a fateful 1,000-mile journey through the Fertile Crescent, along the rivers Tigris and Euphrates, in a great arc bounded by mountain ranges to the north and vast deserts to the south. Far away Hebron lay high in what would become the Judean hills, its pre-biblical landscapes virtually untouched by history, until the arrival of Abraham the Ivri. The word for Hebrew means standing apart, for so stood the man who would father the Jewish nation. And Genesis tells how Abraham moved his tent and dwelt by the plains of Mamre, which are in Hebron, and built there an altar unto the Lord. Abraham and Sarah and their family settle in Hebron. Upon her death at the age of 127, Abraham buries Sarah in the cave of Machpelah, which he purchases together with a surrounding field from Ephron the Hittite for the handsome sum of 400 silver shekels. 38 years later, Abraham too is buried there beside his wife by his sons Isaac and Ishmael. Also buried there are their descendants, Isaac and Rebekah, Jacob and Leah. Yechiel Leiter was born and raised in Scranton, Pennsylvania, before moving to Israel and settling in Hebron. He now serves as Director of Development for the Hebron Renewal Commission.
Historical places all over the world normally represent relics of antiquity, celebrating cultures of civilizations long extinct. The grandeur of the Cave of the Patriarchs is that the ideas and the ideals of the patriarchs and matriarchs buried within her walls are still so very alive, full of vitality, carried by the same people 4,000 years later. This, more than any singular fact, defines the meaning of our return to Hebron 4,000 years after the story of the Jewish people began.
Thus, what was initially a burial site became a holy place to the Jewish people and evolved into a vibrant and enduring center of Jewish life. The Muslims, descendants of Ishmael, also revere Abraham as their forefather, and after the Arab conquest of Palestine, assumed full control of the tombs of the patriarchs, converting the building to a mosque. During the Second Temple period, a large and elegant structure of massive Herodian stone was built over the tombs, and nearly all foreign conquerors have since added to the structure, including the Arabs. From 1266, Jews were forbidden to enter the building and pray at one of their holiest sites, on pain of death, being allowed to ascend only the outside stair as far as the 7th step, where they could insert their prayer petitions into a hole in the stones above the caves. In 1968, after the area was retaken by Israel in the Six-Day War, Jewish prayer was once again restored at the tombs of the patriarchs.
When our oldest son was born, he had his circumcision here in the Cave of the Patriarchs, and we named him Moshe Yedidiah. Moshe after my immediate grandfather, and Yedidiah after the patriarchs, our greatest grandfather. Yedidiah was the name given to the three patriarchs. It means friend of God. We felt that it was as if modern history was uniting with our ancient history in forging our destiny.
Yechiel and his American-born wife Hannah and their 2 children live in Hebron's newest neighborhood on Crusader Hill, known as Tel Rumeda. Nestled at the foot of a large olive orchard, its 1,000-year-old trees stand like ancient guardians over Atmoti Shai, as the area is called, the land and burial place of Jesse, father of King David. The pre-1929 Jewish community of Hebron owned the entire area. Long ago, Jewish children scampered through the olive orchards, picking the olives whose oil would illuminate Hebron's synagogues on the holiday of Lag BaOmer. Today, the olive orchard is owned by Arabs, and a mosque stands over Jesse's grave. But Atmoti Shai resonates anew with the sound of the Hebrew language and the joyous voices of young children that play in the ancient olive groves. It was in Hebron that David was anointed king over Judah and then over all Israel. Here were the beginnings of Israel's greatest royal dynasty. Hebron was the source. In time, Jerusalem would become the throne. Historians and archaeologists believe that the remains of the kingdom of David are here on the windswept heights of Crusader Hill, where 4,000-year-old Canaanite ruins are a window onto the past. For Uri Karzan and his family, another American Jew who has returned to his roots, Crusader Hill is a living history lesson and link with his ancestors. Although Jewish life in the Holy Land was temporarily disrupted by the Babylonian exile and the bondage in Egypt, Jews managed to return and resettle the city. Every would-be conqueror met with fierce opposition on the part of its Jewish defenders. After the return in the days of Ezra and Nehemiah, Jews settled in Kiryat Arba, although they were soon forced to retreat under Edomite pressure. Hebron was liberated in the Maccabean revolt under John Hyrcanos. The city was the scene of the Maccabean battles under Judah the Maccabee and headquarters of the famous Bar Kokhba revolt when it was nearly burned to the ground and Bar Kokhba's warriors sold into Roman slavery at Elone Mamre, the Oaks of Mamre. Then came and went the Romans, Byzantines, Crusaders, Mamelukes, and Arabs. Yet throughout the centuries, pockets of Jewish life remained. When the bitter Roman conquest of 70 AD terminated Jewish independence in the land of Israel, Hebron's Jewish community persisted. When the Arabs conquered the Holy Land in 638 AD, they found the Hebron Hills densely populated with Jewish settlements. One such settlement was Susia, whose majestic remains stand to this day on the South Hebron Mountains in silent testimony to the grandeur of ancient Israel. The architectural beauty of its synagogue, mosaics, and living areas weave a rich tapestry of bygone Jewish life, which flourished here as early as the 2nd century, linking Jews with the land during the centuries of exile. For more than 400 years, the Hebron Jewish community persevered as one of the 4 holy cities in Israel. During the Middle Ages, its scholars and physicians were renowned and widely quoted abroad. In 1540, Rabbi Malkiel Ashkenazi established a large Jewish quarter and constructed the Avraham Avinu Synagogue, a classic example of simplicity and beauty in the heart of the Jewish quarter. Many legends and stories developed surrounding the Father Abraham's synagogue's sanctity and significance.
The synagogue itself was built in 1540 by the Sephardic Jewish community and served the Jewish community of Hebron for nearly 400 years. Legend has it that in 1619, when a plague broke out in Hebron and most of the inhabitants had to flee, there came to Yom Kippur evening 9 men for the Yom Kippur service, for the Kol Nidre service, and they were afraid that they wouldn't have the 10 men for the quorum. Right before Kol Nidre, an old man with a long white beard came into the synagogue and said, let's begin the Kol Nidre service. And he stayed in the synagogue for the entire Yom Kippur service and disappeared as soon as Yom Kippur was over. Of course, everyone was terribly upset that they could not invite the man in for something to eat. And later on that night, he came to the Chazan in a dream, and he told him, fear not, for I am Avraham Avinu. I am Abraham, the first Jew, who came from the cave of the patriarchs so nearby to help my children make a minyan on this Yom Kippur.
Finally, the long caravan of history brought modern Christian pilgrims, secular Jewish settlers, and in 1917, the victorious British Army and their subsequent partition of Palestine. A key feature of life in Hebron was the natural coexistence of Jews and Arabs, which had prevailed for centuries, and who jointly benefited from this shared communal life. This was to end in the 1920s as rampaging Arab nationalism caught the Jews of Hebron in its fiery grip, culminating in the gruesome riots of 1929.
In 1929, most of the Jewish community was destroyed. 69 Jews were killed in the massacre, The synagogue itself turned into a public toilet, a sheep and goat pen. The Torah scrolls were burned, except for these two.
The victims included young and old, scholars, rabbis, and secular Jews, many cruelly mutilated, women, children, the doctors and nurses of Hadassah House. In addition to the dead, more than 300 were seriously wounded. The British had done nothing to avert the attack. A few Jews tried to remain in Hebron, but a further attack in 1936 caused the remnant to flee, thus ending nearly 4,000 years of continuous Jewish life in Hebron. They would not return for another generation. In Israel's War of Independence in 1948, Hebron and the rest of Judea and Samaria, including East Jerusalem, are captured and annexed by the Jordanians in 1950. Jews are barred by King Hussein from living in Hebron, and for the next 18 years, Hebron is Judenrein. The ancient Jewish cemetery is plowed under and turned into a vegetable patch. May 1967. Egypt's President Nasser, seeking the hegemony of the Arab world and vowing to destroy Israel, closes the Straits of Tiran to Israel, a clear act of war, and moves thousands of troops toward the Israeli border. Jordan joins the military alliance with Egypt. June 5, 1967. Confronted with a threat to her very survival, Israel launches a preemptive attack that begins the Six-Day War, and in the victory that follows, changes history and the map of the Middle East. Judea and Samaria are taken from Jordan, along with East Jerusalem and Hebron. The tombs of the patriarchs are restored to Jewish access by the army's chief rabbi, Shlomo Goren, who enters Hebron accompanied only by 2 aides. Jewish prayer is heard once again at the Cave of Machpelah, but the government takes no steps to restore Jewish life to Hebron itself. In the spring of 1968, Rabbi Moshe Levinger and his wife Miriam lead 120 Jews to celebrate Passover in Hebron for the first time in over 30 years. After staying in the Park Hotel, the group decides to remain and settle in Hebron despite government opposition. Refusing to leave, the group remains for 3 difficult years awaiting housing, living in an army camp, petitioning the government for the right to live in Hebron. In 1971, a partial victory. The government decides to build the Jewish suburb of Kiryat Arba on a hill outside Hebron.
After Six-Day War, when we could come back to Hebron, we decided to come back. We gathered a group, and we continued the old history, the important history of Hebron.
And in the beginning, we lived in the military compound. And after starting off in an Arab hotel in Hebron, and from the military compound, we moved to Kiryat Arba, a new neighborhood which was built inside of Hebron.
So we did the most important thing that we could do to the Jewish people to continue our old important history in these old cities in Eretz Israel, in our old country.
Today, Kiryat Arba is a growing, vibrant community of 6,000 Jews. It is trees growing where none grew before. Clean streets of rough-hewn native stone, new homes, schools, yeshivot, shops, a field study school. Its residents, young and old, from around the world, including the newest immigrants, the ancient Jewish community of Ethiopia, rescued in Operation Moses. It is the surge and hum of industry in a modern industrial zone as technologies old and new are harnessed and developed. It is the sweet and dry wines of Hebron's ancient vineyards replanted and nurtured anew. It is the Opana Girls Academy, where 230 young women of many backgrounds and ethnic groups, Jews from modern and ancient stocks, learn the skills for tomorrow while keeping alive the heritage of the past.
And the main thing was not only that pioneers, a little group, came here and made here a new congregation, but we made it as pioneers for the Jewish people and for the Jewish government.
Professor Ben-Zion Tafka, a renowned Soviet Jewish physicist, arrived in Hebron in 1974 and undertook by himself the restoration of the old Jewish cemetery. The cemetery and the graves of the 1929 victims restored, Tafka, who had been a refusenikt in the USSR, began to teach physics at the university. But soon he would devote more and more of his energies to the restoration of Jewish Hebron. He now undertook a most challenging task, rehabilitation of the ruined Abraham Avinu synagogue, which was buried under garbage, having been reduced to a goat pen and public toilet. Opposition soon came from several quarters, the local Arabs and even the Israeli government, which hauled him into court. But the professor stood firm in his beliefs and purpose and prevailed. Slowly the ruins of the once noble synagogue were restored and transformed. The professor soon relinquished his teaching post to devote his full energies to the rebuilding of Hebron, and with his wife and 3 children settled in Kiryat Arba. The fully restored Abraham Avinu synagogue opened once again to the sounds of prayer in May 1981, after nearly 55 years of ruination and desecration.
The age of the parchment tells a story, and the words give it meaning. The Torah scrolls remained in Jerusalem until 1985. After the synagogue had been restored, the Ark rebuilt, erasing the carnage and desolation of 60 years, the Torah scrolls were returned to their original Ark. The first Torah was returned to the Ark by an 80-year-old survivor, representing the generation of yesteryear which still lives. The second Torah was returned to the Ark by an Ethiopian Jew, who crossed the Sudanese desert over 2 years to return to the land of Israel and to settle in Hebron.
But Professor Tavger did not live to fully enjoy the fruits of his dedication and vision. He passed away in August 1983 at the age of 52, while much of his work was in progress. Like the man, the synagogue is a model of dignity and simplicity. Like the synagogue, the man holds a special place in the hearts of his people. The rebirth of the Jewish quarter is his legacy. For some time now, many in the Kiryat Arba community had hoped to return to the heart of Hebron itself and rebuild the community. Foremost among those was Mrs. Miriam Levinger, the wife of the rabbi who had initiated the return in the spring of 1968.
We had the feeling that something was wrong, that somehow by living in a suburb in Hebron, we weren't really fulfilling what we had set out to do, which was to live in Hebron proper and live in the old neighborhood where Jews had lived until the tragedy of 1929. It was at this point that a group of women, we had a meeting, and we decided that we would move to Hebron, in one of the spots where Jews formerly lived. It was decided to move to what is called Beit Hadassah. Beit Hadassah was formerly a clinic where Jews and Arabs were treated by a staff of Jewish physicians and nurses. Until 1929, it served the city of Hebron. When we decided to move into Hebron, it was empty. It had been empty since the Six-Day War. And one night, about 12 women and 30 children left Kiryat Arba at 3 o'clock in the morning. And we went down to the street, which is behind Beit Hadassah. We put up a ladder to the courtyard, and all the women and children scurried up the ladder into the courtyard and into Beit Hadassah. We announced that we'd come to establish the new Jewish community in Hebron proper.
At first, the group's action meets with strong opposition from the Israeli government, which feared strong Arab resentment and reaction.
There was a lot of discussion in government circles before it began. In the end, the people in the government decided to leave the women and children there, but we were told that whoever went out the front gate couldn't come back in again. So we stayed in Beit Hadassah, and supplies were brought to us. We had no running water, no electricity, no windows. And we lived like that for about half a year, at which point my son became sick from hepatitis, and then a commission came to examine the conditions in Beit Hadassah, and the authorities decided to put in electricity and running water. And when it became cold after the summer, they also put in doors and windows. We lived like that for 8 months, women and children only. However, after 2 months, we were told that those living in Beit Hadassah could come and go as they wish, just we couldn't have other people coming into Beit Hadassah. So the children started going to school, and the women went out to buy supplies, and we didn't need help from the outside anymore.
Gradually, life in Hebron takes on a semblance of normalcy in and around Beit Hadassah as new families moved in and restoration continued. On Friday nights, yeshiva students from Kiryat Arba would take part in Sabbath services for the women of Beit Hadassah. Then, on a Friday night in May 1980, tragedy strikes suddenly and bitterly.
On Friday evening, after services, the people came from Marat HaMachila, from the Tomb of the Patriarchs, and just as they were reaching Beit Hadassah, 4 terrorists attacked them.
Arab terrorists, prepositioned on the adjacent rooftops and in alleyways, opened fire on the students with automatic weapons and grenades.
And suddenly I saw my daughter get up from the floor, and she said, "Mama, we've been attacked."
Minutes later, 6 young men are dead, scores more wounded.
There were people lying around and other people calling for help. This happened about a year after we had come to Beit Hadassah.
Overcoming its grief, the Jewish community establishes a yeshiva in downtown Hebron in memory of the 6 youths. Today, the Yeshiva Shavei Hebron numbers 110 students who combine Torah studies with army service, and a new tradition begins. Moving swiftly in the wake of the tragedy, the government of Prime Minister Menachem Begin decides to allow Jews to resettle in the heart of Hebron itself and rehabilitate the old Jewish quarter. The Jewish community's answer to terrorism and its attempted destruction is resolve and resettlement. Today, old Hebron lives anew. Its ancient stony walls and alleyways buzz with the sounds of buildings. Abandoned and destroyed buildings and old Jewish dwellings are rebuilt and reoccupied by young Jewish families. Today, 400 Jews have returned to Hebron, among them descendants of members of the destroyed Jewish community of 1929. Among those who have recently moved to Beit Hadassah complex is a young Israeli and his American-born wife, Avinoam and Shani Horowitz.
Because this house was owned by the chief Sephardic rabbi at Hebron. His name was Rabbi Chamoch Chasson. This rabbi was a great rabbi that led the Jewish community at Hebron for about 30 years, till this tragedy that he was murdered together with 69 Jews that Shabbos, and from that time this house was empty from the rabbi, was empty from the Jews. And we feel now that by coming here into this house, we're bringing the new blood, the new life, we're bringing the redemption to this house.
What I was looking for in Israel was a place where my being there, just living, settling, sitting wherever I was sitting, would make an impression.
The wedding in Hebron is a time of special joy and hope, for here it takes on added meaning. A beginning in a place of many beginnings. In a city filled with symbols, it is a symbol unto itself. Gershon Bar Kokhba is a tank commander in the Israel Defense Forces, a fighter like his famous namesake 1900 years earlier, who will wed his bride Shlomit in 3,000-year-old traditions of the Jewish people. Although marrying in Kiryat Arba, these Bar Kokhbas have decided to begin their life together in Old Hebron, where they will live in a tiny apartment in the heart of the 16th century alleyways of the old Jewish quarter. The visions of Ben Zion Tavger and Rabbi Levinger continue to be realized as formerly Jewish homes are reclaimed for living. Some still bear the scars of past violence. The splot for a mezuzah, or holy scroll, in the doorposts of houses indicates prior Jewish ownership. The number of families moving to Hebron continues to grow. Thus, what was begun almost single-handedly by the Jerusalem rabbi has now gained a momentum of its own.
that's really all the idea. What we're doing in Hebron is to take Hebron, which is one of the greatest cities in Eretz Israel, which was always full of Jews, and now it was empty. We're going into those houses, and we're bringing the redemption once again to the city of our patriarchs.
The historical and religious link of Jews to Hebron and Judea and Samaria has gained a new element since the Six-Day War, the question of security. One of the foremost proponents of the importance of Hebron to the security of Israel is Yechiel, a well-known attorney, former Labor Party activist, and one of the original founders of the Gush Amuni movement.
Whereas the bulk of the Jewish population of Israel is concentrated in the west, in the plains near the sea in the west, and if these areas are under enemy fire, then the soldiers won't get to their units, won't get to the depots where the tanks and all the other war material is. There is no Israeli army at all.
General Raphael Eitan is a former chief of staff and decorated war hero. He fought in the Six-Day War, and it was he who, during the early days of the Yom Kippur War, commanded the brigade that stopped the Syrian onslaught on the Golan Heights. In 1982, General Eitan was chief of staff during the Lebanon War, now heads the Tzommet party in Parliament.
Whoever holds and occupies Judea and Samaria, this mountainous block, dominates all of Israel, and this is the only natural barrier Israel has against an eastern front. This mountainous block has the only 4 road crossings from east to west, and going from south to north, we have the most important junctions: Hebron, Jerusalem, Nablus, Shechem, and Tappuah. Whoever holds these 4 locations is able to move in every direction in this vital area. Whoever wishes to move east, north, south, and west must hold on to these 4 places, and Hebron and Jerusalem are the most important of them.
The place where you are now, if you put a cannon here, not the heaviest, which has a reach of 30 kilometers, from here, you bombard Jerusalem. These are the dimensions of this country. American public doesn't understand this.
Were the area in question an open area, you could cross it in half an hour with regular tanks. But since it is a mountainous area, you can only move on one axis. But if you are in control of it, then this mountainous area acts as a break or barrier to an invader.
The main invading route of Jerusalem in history, during the war of the Maccabees, Lysias, from here, in 48, the Egyptian army reached Jerusalem, almost captured Ramat Rachel. Where did the Egyptian army came from? They came from here. The Egyptian army came through Hebron, invaded Jerusalem. This is what happens to us once the central ridge, the Via Appia of the Jewish people, because the Via Appia of the Jewish people is where Abraham came from Shechem, Nablus, through Beit El, past Jerusalem, lived in Hebron, and with his flock of sheep between Hebron, commuted, and Beersheba. Shechem, Beersheba is our Via Appia. Historically, it is our lifeline strategically. If the mountain ridge, the center of the Judea mountain ridge being Hebron, is in enemy hands, for example, if they can lob Katyusha fire into the vulnerable areas, there is no Israeli army, there is no Israeli state, there is no Israeli people, finished. Then we have peace. This is the peace the Arabs are really meaning.
The importance and significance of Hebron to the state of Israel is underscored in a visit to Hebron by Prime Minister Yitzhak Shamir. At the yeshiva, he encourages the young men to be strong, be determined, and have faith in their cause. In speaking with soldiers and residents, his words reflect his concern for the future of Hebron. As in days of old, so today Hebron has become the symbol of the renewal of the Jewish people's national life in the land of Israel, and our right to live in every part of the land. May you go from strength to strength as Judaism's oldest city comes to life.
Did you hear what came to the ship? Very strong, heavy. We are all with you.
מי שמדבר על חיים ביחד באותה הארץ של יהודים וערבים לא יכול לומר, וזה לא הוגן לומר,
Whoever talks about coexistence in a country of Jews and Arabs can't say, and it's improper to say, and it's hypocrisy to say, that in the entire country you can live together, but in certain areas you can't. Why can an Arab live in Nazareth, Akko, Carniel, and also in Tel Aviv, and Jews are forbidden to live amid the Arabs?
You know, Tel Aviv began also with a little group, and after it became a big city. Now there are in Tel Aviv more than 400,000 Jews, and Netanya and Herzliya. All of these places began as little congregations. But afterwards, everyone became a big city. And we are sure that Jews will enter more and more to Hebron, and here will be also a congregation of 200 or 300,000 of Jews.
And what I felt is that I felt that I was capable for this challenge, to be in a city where it's not exactly, a simple thing to bring up a family and to exist on a daily basis. And what I felt is that if I was capable of doing so, then that was my job to do that. And what we're doing here is just leading our lives normally and bringing back the Jewish existence to a Jewish city.
And so life in Hebron moves forward. Despite politics, uncertainty, and tragedy, Jews are returning in ever greater numbers. Hebron is a living example of collective memory. It is song and stories, tales told from generation to generation. With the faces of its young, its settlers, determined to push back the past and challenge the future. It is history and heritage and hopes and the laughter of children and the sounds of prayer. It is the cave of the patriarchs and the dynasty of David in a short distance that spans 1,000 years, and both the beginnings of the Jewish people and its greatest kingdom. For these are powerful truths and all part of the fabric of the land and people of Israel. But for those who have returned, it is only a beginning, and they are confident that they and their children after them shall indeed prosper and remain at play in the gardens of Abraham.